Not for the first time in his colourful political career, Boris Johnson has set a metaphorical cat amongst the pigeons. He has put the government of his successor, Rishi Sunak, in a mighty awkward spot by handing all the unedited WhatsApp messages and notebooks requested by the COVID inquiry to the Cabinet Office. What's more, Mr Johnson wants them to be passed on to the inquiry urgently. Now, followers of this increasingly peculiar saga will know that the Cabinet Office started out by saying it wasn't going to hand over a lot of the messages because they were not relevant. When the chair of the inquiry said relevance was for her to determine, they then claimed they didn't have the notes and messages after all. Now, we know they definitely do have them. In fact, Mr Johnson's spokesman says the material has been available for months. So what you might ask is the hold-up. Is it Mr Sunak who is worried about what they may reveal, or someone else at the top of government? And if so, why?
His daily addresses to the nation affected every single one of our lives. Now, Boris Johnson says he's handed over the material he used to inform his decisions during the pandemic.
We're at a pivotal point now in the early 21st century, right?
Today, the former Prime Minister was speaking about the war in Ukraine, but his actions off camera have piled pressure on the current government. Boris Johnson's material includes 24 notebooks, his diaries and WhatsApp messages with cabinet ministers, advisers and senior civil servants. Johnson's team said the Cabinet Office has had access to that for several months and received more material today. But the Cabinet Office is refusing to give the COVID inquiry material it does not consider relevant.
Can the inquiry do its job properly if it doesn't have complete access to all this information that the Cabinet Office has got?
No, and the reason for that very simply is the inquiry has to have confidence. It only has confidence if it's seen as independent of government, and it only has confidence as a result if it's seen to get the material it thinks it needs.
The Cabinet Office's own lawyers are assessing what material should be handed over. The independent chair of the COVID inquiry says that should be for her to decide. One cabinet minister during the pandemic just wants the inquiry to begin.
Why then is the Cabinet Office being less transparent than the former Prime Minister?
The Cabinet Office has a responsibility to good government and to say, look, this is just silly. And this inquiry that's already cost apparently £100 million of taxpayers' money will go on forever. That we won't have died of COVID, we'll have died of old age before this inquiry is finished if it carries on at this rate.
The inquiry has given the government a deadline of 4 o'clock tomorrow to change its mind. This morning, ministers were hoping for a quick resolution.
Well, we provided, as I say, 55,000 documents, all these witness statements, corporate witness statements and so on. There are these WhatsApps which are being looked into by the Cabinet Office at the moment. There is this deadline tomorrow, and it may well be that everything is resolved by then.
Boris Johnson's move today has set a new precedent for the COVID inquiry and piled pressure on his successor to follow his course.
And Harry is here to shed some light on all this. Look, this is rather a peculiar saga, isn't it? I mean, Boris Johnson probably rather enjoying putting his successor in an awkward spot. But what's going on here? Why? Who doesn't want to hand these over and why not?
Well, the government says that ministers aren't involved in any of the decisions about what is handed over to the inquiry and what isn't. They say independent lawyers are in charge of that. A KC, in fact, is making that assessment over what to give the inquiry. They say this is the usual way of doing things, and ministers say there's absolutely nothing to hide here. Ultimately, though, of course, the Prime Minister is in charge of the government. If he wanted to, he could order the Cabinet Office to hand over all this information, and you would assume the Cabinet Office would have to follow his instructions. Now, we did get a bit of a flavour of what government decision-making was like when those messages from Matt Hancock were leaked to the Daily Telegraph and published there. And I think it's fair to say that that flavour we got didn't shed that decision-making by ministers during the pandemic in the best light. So you can understand why there may be some reluctance to hand over all of this information completely unredacted. Now, tomorrow there's this deadline of 4 p.m. set by Baroness Hallett, the chair of the inquiry. If there's no resolution, she says she will go to the courts, and it will be the courts that decide whether the Cabinet Office or she prevails. I think the bigger picture here is, look, this COVID inquiry hasn't even started yet. The first televised hearing's not due to begin for another 2 weeks, and already this row with government has sort of exploded over what information the inquiry has got access to. This inquiry is expected to go on for years and years, and I think it's already clear it's not just going to have an impact on this government, it's going to have an impact on previous governments and future governments as well.
Harry, that was very clear. Thank you very much indeed.